So to start with, I wanted to start from what is often discussed as the classic canon of beauty. And I have here a picture of one of my favorite scholars, who is Italian like me, Umberto Eco. And Umberto Eco, as many of you know, is a semiologist. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago, and he studied quite deeply both beauty and ugliness. In this beautiful book, which is beautiful in its own right, I actually have it here just to show that I've written it. I have actually, I wish I've written it, but I have read it. And in this beautiful book full of pictures and paintings, what Umberto Eco does, he provides, if you want, an historical overview of canons of beauty and how canons of beauty evolve. And what seems to be quite almost defining a classical canon of beauty is three features. First of all, proportion, second, symmetry, and third, harmony. And this is across history. And as you know, beauty can be subjective and canons of beauty can change. But those three features are part of what has been considered throughout many years and throughout history, the classic canon of beauty. And sometimes canons of beauty in art, but more generally also in life, transform. Now, this was an inspiration to me because it made me think, are there canons of beauty somehow implicit or explicit in the way we actually theorize in organization management theory? And so what came to mind next was perhaps the classic portrait of theory in our field. And again, at the risk of oversimplifying, I think one of the most common representation visually of theory in our field, in organization management theory, generally is arrows and boxes. Boxes and arrows, they are linked to each other. And another typical representation that is less visual but more verbal is propositions or hypotheses, where a theory is a verbal statement that is often of the correlational type. The more of X, the more of Y. Those are, as I said, I'm over generalizing here, I'm over stereotyping if you want, but those visual and verbal representation of theory somehow often feature symmetry, linearity, and a level of proportion in a way that is somehow similar to the classic canons of beauty. Now, think about the statement, the more of X, the more of Y, right? The more of whatever, differentiation in an organizational structure, the higher the performance of the organization. That statement is inherently and by definition symmetrical, and is often proportionate in terms of the kind of words that you use are almost symmetrical and match each other, right? In the first part of the sentence, in the second part of the sentence, and that statement is also linear. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, I'm overgeneralizing here because correlational theorizing, as has been called by Delbridge and Fiss, is not the only style of theorizing, but it is fair to say that if you think about a PhD program in a business school, on average, a good portion of our training is in correlational theorizing. We tend to think in linear terms, in terms that are somehow proportionate and symmetrical. However, there's been a lot of debate generally and recently, most importantly, about the fact that correlational theorizing is not the only style of theorizing. Think, for example, about this beautiful paper, I would say, in its own right, of Joop Cornelissen, Marcus Euler and co-authors in organization theory. Now, why is this a problem? And is this a problem? Now, in its own right, a classical canon of beauty in theorizing and in theory is not a problem in its own right. It's actually helpful. And it has been helpful to simplify a number of hypotheses, propositions, and theories that have been very helpful. Think, for example, transaction cost economics, just to mention one, right, that receive a Nobel Prize and is inherently a sort of correlational and contingent form of theory. Now, but there is a problem, which is that beauty, that classical notion of beauty of theories, that linearity, symmetry, and proportion, is somehow it also hides away. It's also deceitful. There is also a deceit of that theory. That theory is that beauty is somehow also hides something from us. The first thing is that the world is not linear, and it's not simple, and it's not often symmetrical. And so I start from a premise that the world is actually causally complex, and particularly social phenomena are causally complex. And so they are best understood as configurations of multiple attributes that combine together in often contradictory ways. So take, for example, just as an example, COVID-19 diffusion, right? There have been a lot of policymakers trying to essentially use the same recipe to fight against COVID and prevent flattening the curve, as we heard for 2 years, right? And so prevent the diffusion and the spread of COVID. But the results of those similar policies across countries have been very different, right? And partially because social phenomena are complex, and so it depends on not just on the policy, but also how people react to the policy, and not just on how people react to the policy, but also on the temperature, for example, atmospheric and physical conditions that may favor the spread of the virus, but also the structure and the topology of cities or communities, right? So epidemiologists know this all too well, that there is a complexity. Is there anyone who wanted to say something? I was just checking in because I heard somebody unmuting. Yes, Ravi, please.
As you started with beauty as the starting foundation for your talk, I was suddenly reminded of the great philosopher Plato. Mm-hmm. Plato, who famously said, he called it the highest ideals, or the ultimate goals of human existence, is to seek or attain three things: beauty, then truth, and goodness. You started with beauty, but I think truth and goodness are also other pursuits worthy of consideration. Because, for example, goodness, when I think of this ideal goodness, I am always reminded of Mother Teresa's work in Calcutta in India. There's no beauty in there. It's all dirty, but it's pure goodness of art. And when I think of truth, which is what you're trying to apply here, I think that's the real pursuit of academia. We are trying to uncover the latent truths and bring them to the surface. And sometimes there's beauty in it, and sometimes there's not beauty in it, but beauty is not the ultimate goal. Seeking new knowledge, seeking more explanation of unknowns and varying variables is really the driver for academia. And I don't think in academia we try to look at beauty as a driver. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's an excellent point, and I think it makes me think. First of all, I love that sort of triangle of three core goals and purposes from Plato: beauty, truth, and goodness. And there is a lot of emphasis these days on the good life, going back also to Aristotle, but also more recently, the pragmatist philosophers and the egos, right? The European Conference, the European Group of Organization Studies this year is about the good life. I think somehow the pursuit of truth has been somehow became the specialized domain over time of science, as you mentioned, Ravi. But one of the provocations I have today for you all is, should it be? In the sense that you could think of those three things being combined as part of a broader initiative where science has become this sort of seek knowledge, seek rigor, but that rigor in and itself, and especially in humanist sciences and in social sciences, can be beautiful in its own right, and could be multiple conceptions of beauty there, right? So if you think about qualitative research in social sciences broadly, it is concerned with seeking knowledge and explaining action, perhaps sometimes in, explainable terms, but it's also concerned with interpreting experiences, interpreting life. And in that interpretation, there is a call towards beauty. So we have interpretation of life, we have explanation of life, and those two somehow have historically became disconnected. One is the domain of science, explanation of life, and the other one is interpretation of life, is the domain of arts, is the domain of humanistic, perhaps, literature. Perhaps those two things could be somehow combined. But I love the distinctions, and I think it is an important distinction in terms of beauty, truth, and goodness. Thank you for your point. Was there another question? Yes, love the reference to John Keats. Thank you. Yeah. So, so let me perhaps just go ahead in terms of this particular example. One of the things that that this classical portrait of beauty that has indeed been associated with explanation in a classic naturalistic science notion. One thing that can hide away is the complexity of the real world, and the fact that the real world is not symmetrical, and is indeed complex, non-linear, and it's often quite ugly in the sense that it's difficult to simplify it. It's messy. And I had the example here of COVID-19 diffusion. If you look at this figure here and contrast that with the boxes and arrows figure, this figure here is much more messy. There are arrows that go all the way, they go back and forth. And so it's perhaps more difficult to figure out what's happening here. But perhaps it's closer to what's going on in the real world. The other issue with the classical notion of beauty and that classical notion in terms of proportion, symmetry, and harmony is that if we think not about theory in terms of the end outcome, the ultimate outcome of our theorizing, but we think about the process through which we as researchers get to that theory. So for those of you who have done theorizing in action, who have developed theories, models, frameworks, you know that the way in which you go through your ideas and put those ideas together is often non-linear, and it's often quite messy. It's a messy process. So what I have here is a real picture of a real model in the making, a model they have in a paper, a theory if you want. But before getting into the clean figure that could be in a PowerPoint format, that could be in an article format, that could be published, those figures are often on a piece of paper or are also on a slide, but they are messy. There are arrows going everywhere. There are labels that don't make much sense. There are labels that are often confusing. There are no clear definitions. So that's a real way in which I typically theorize, right? I'm drawing very strange figures around words. And to me, that is somehow putting a boundary that could be more or less porous. Now, theorizing is different from theory in its own right. Theory is somehow more elegant, is the end product, is the outcome. Theorizing as a process includes activities like the way we imagine, the way we mentally simulate and simulate in our own mind, the way we articulate in words our arguments, or our concepts, the way we visualize with figures and sketches, those practical everyday activities are what constitutes theorizing. Now, if you look at theory in the social sciences, generally there is this conception I often get asked when I teach my PhD students or go and give workshops around conceptual papers, for example. How do you get your ideas, or how do you write up a conceptual paper? It feels like almost perfect when you see it, like it clicks, right? But what we as readers often don't see is almost the pain and the process the authors have been going through in getting to that clean format. That clean format actually hides away from us the fact that theorizing as a process can be quite ugly, can be incomplete, can be imperfect, can be asymmetrical, and it's messy. So before getting to the clean version, you actually, as Carl Weick used to say, rack your brain. So it's racking your brain. It's actually physically and emotionally, and somebody brought up feeling in the chat. In terms of feeling, trying to understand something, to theorize, to come up with an explanation can be a quite emotional, full of feelings and sometimes painful experience. Now, here is an example where a number of co-authors and I have tried to visualize a process of theorizing, which we have defined as configurational theorizing, often associated with methodologies like fuzzy set QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, but more generally with qualitative case study, I would say, or with other methodologies. You could use it potentially with different sorts of methods. But that process of theorizing is non-linear and is more messy. What you see in this figure is several feedback loops that go between these different stages. So this is just an example to give you a sense of, can we be a bit more honest about our theorizing in our field and recognize that this process is more messy, is non-linear, is in fact not as perfect as it looks when we look at one theory as a finished product. And so what you see here, configurational theorizing, is just an example, is theorizing the aim at identifying configurations or recipes or combinations of explanatory attributes that are linked with a phenomenon of interest, with an outcome. So for example, you want to explain the reduction of CO2 emissions. What are the explanatory attributes that can explain why some organizations reduce CO2 emissions versus others don't? So if reduction of CO2 emissions is your outcome, how can you identify those explanatory attributes? And so one first reasoning cycle or theorizing cycle that my co-authors and I have identified is called scoping. And scoping is about identifying relevant attributes that can explain that phenomenon in combination. And in this combination, in configuration, here you're trying to embrace and include more of that ugliness, of that complexity of the real world. And so you start from complexity to embrace as much complexity as you can. And you start, second, to go through a cycle where you try to link those attributes by thinking conjunctively, thinking equifinally, or thinking about absence. For example, what could be the conjunctions between those attributes? Let's say if one key factor is the corporation, if we're talking about organizations that reduce CO2 emissions, is that they had a visible pledge out there. They signed, for example, the Principle for Responsible Investment or any other UN kind of agreement, a pledge in the public. So if that is a factor, how that interacts with whoever is the CEO or whatever the financial performance is. So you think in terms of conjunctions on how those attributes could interact and combine. And you can also think about which attributes is present and whether the absence in its own right of an attribute can contribute for the recipe to work. And so not just about the presence of the attributes, but the absence of the attributes. And finally, once you start identifying some configurations or recipes that work, you can then go and label those configurations and try to capture why those different combinations of attributes could capture part of that complexity. So this is just really one example. It's not the way of doing it at all. That's not why I'm referring to this. It's just one way in which we could be, as scholars, a little bit more honest about the feedback loops and back and forth in our theorizing process. And we can also strive to capture more of that complexity, non-linearity, asymmetry, and if you want, ugliness and messiness of the real world. And so configurational theorizing is a process that starts from complexity and messiness, but from that tries to get to a simple, if nuanced and fine-grained model or theory, where you have multiple recipes that can bring you to the same outcome. As they say, equifinal pathways to the same outcome, or multiple streets that lead to Rome, so to speak. Now, a practical example, if you want to dig into this, is this table of a configuration. This table, it comes from a paper that another group of coders and myself have recently published in Management Science. Is an example of a configurational theory where they uses in this particular paper a number of methods. It is FSQCA, fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis, is case studies and interviews, and is also quantitative methods. What you see represented here is the classical table that visualizes the configurations as per qualitative comparative analysis, QCA. So the black circles is the presence of an element, and the cross circle is the absence of an element, and the blank space is the element could be either present or absent. And you could read this table vertically, where each of these 1, 2, 3, 4 is different configurations or recipes for an outcome, the same outcome. What the outcome was, and this is an example that I want to use to then show in the next slides also what was the previous version of this table when we were in the theorizing and going across that messy process. So this is the final, if you want, published version, the configurational theory that tries to simplify that complexity, but keep a level of nuance and keep a level of being fine-grained and granular. But I'll show you more in a second in the next slide on how messy our process was. So what we see here, let me just explain briefly what this is. What we see here was we were trying to explain engagement success. And engagement success is shareholder engagement that we're talking about. So it's coalition of shareholders, group of investors getting together into coalitions to exercise pressure on corporates to let them reduce the level of CO2 emissions or adopt climate change, climate action practices that can address this big complex problem. What we didn't know is what kind of levers or tactics these shareholders can use to succeed in their engagement with their corporate targets. And so engagement success here means that the coalitions of investors have actually succeeded in changing the corporate behavior, in having these companies reducing CO2 emissions and adopting practices. How do they do that? They adopt different and combine different levers and different recipes. So for example, here you see on the vertical axis, trust the experts. The first configuration is a combination of different levers that they used, which is, for example, using large coalition of investors that represent a large stake in the company, and experienced coalition on financial material issues, targeting certain type of target firms. And you can see on 2, 3, 4 different recipes, which we label and name to capture more of that complexity. Eventually, towards the end, we came to realize that what was emerging was a complex configurational theory where these coalitions of investors tailor specific combinations of levers to fit the financial capacity and environmental predispositions of target firms. So if you have a target that you want to change their behavior, you can combine the recipe of your levers to target the receptivity of that particular company. So we call this theory tailored to target. So what I'm trying to represent here is a complex configuration theory that does not provide a silver bullet solution that is in line with that arrows and boxes visualization of a theory, the classical canon of beauty that is symmetrical and is, if you want, the more of this, the more of that, is bivariate. But rather, what you have here is complexity. Is multiple elements, they operate at the same time and can operate in different ways and still get you and lead you to the same outcome. So it's a theory in 4 parts, or if you want, there are 4 tails, right, that you can tell. There are 4 configurations, but you can then find simplicity by looking at what's in common among these configurations. And on the other hand, if you contrast the engagement success with the engagement failure, what you will realize is that the results are not the immediate mirror image, it's not the reverse. And so in a classic regression framework or in a classic correlational theory, what you have is that if the more of X is associated with the more of Y, then the reverse is also true. It means that the less of X is also associated or leads to the less of Y, right? And so what you see is that correlation theorizing is symmetrical by definition, and instead here you can have asymmetry. You can have negative outcomes, if you want, engagement failure, that does not result to the opposite of the positive configurations, the positive explanation, but rather results from different combinations. And so what makes you sick, to use an analogy, is not necessarily the reverse of what makes you healthy. So the word is asymmetrical, and to capture that asymmetry, you need an expanded vocabulary and an expanded set of tools. So maybe I'll pause a second before showing the theorizing. So I'll pause here for a second and invite any questions you may have regarding these different, what we have covered so far. So if there is anyone who wants to either share their questions on the chat or just unmute themselves, I'll be happy to entertain any comments or questions.
Hello, it's Peter in Zurich.
Hi, Peter.
Hi. Going back to your original point about the world being very complex and messy, I find myself puzzled as to why then it's useful for us to have a concept like beauty, especially one which seems to have parts which are like symmetry, globally seen as being good. Does that necessarily or suggest that trying to chase beauty in our theory or theories that are beautiful is a bad thing?
It's a good question. I would not think so. I mean, I would think that actually trying to strive for beauty in our theories is important, if anything, and I would say more about that in my provocations. Beautiful theories could resonate potentially more and becomes more widely understood because they can speak to people in a way that perhaps science in its traditional form has not been able to speak to people, right? I will talk in a second about conspiracy theories and how conspiracy theories, we may like them or not like them, I'm not expressing a judgment here, but they have a stronger aesthetic component that speaks somehow more directly to the feelings of people. They are more empathic. So I think seeking beauty could be helpful for science. So that's partially my answer to Ravi's previous point. Can we reconcile truth and beauty? And have we artificially somehow specialize these 2 domains, one in the arts and the other one in the sciences, in a way that perhaps that hasn't helped either field both fields. But I guess to the first part of your question, Peter, I guess, and I don't have this clear in my mind yet, but to me, to strive for beautiful theory, we cannot sort of forget, or we need to start from ugliness. We need to start from messiness. We need to start from the messiness of the real world, because it's not helpful to just start from the outcome. It's like looking at what Leonardo painted. It's not helpful to become Leonardo. And that's what I was trying to get at. I don't know if that addresses your point.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. The only thought that crosses my mind is there must be some functional use to beauty beside it being beautiful. So at the end of the process, at the end of theorizing, is there a functional use in having a beautiful theory, as you say, misused in, say, conspiracy theories? But I'll stop there and let you move to the next question. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a quick 10 seconds comment on Peter's point. I think there are some suggestions already in seeking truth, which is parsimony. Seek parsimony, make it simpler but not simple. So there are some guidelines which are suggesting when you're seeking truth, try to strive for parsimony. It's not seeking beauty, but you're seeking truth in a more parsimonious way, and that's how we deal with complexity. I stop there.
Excellent point. Very briefly, I'm not against, to be very straightforward on the answer, I'm not against parsimony. I just think that somehow the search for parsimony has sometimes been socialized and reified in academia, in the social sciences, in organizational management theory, in a way that we often may fall in a trap, which is reductionism. I think there are different ways of getting to parsimony and getting to a parsimonious model and a simple model. And one is to start from complexity, embrace that complexity, and try through that complexity to simplify, which means I embrace, first of all, as much complexity as possible, but then have tricks of the trade, heuristics to get to parsimony. The other one is I'll start making assumptions and I'll start bounding and thinking in a way that is somehow reductionist, which is somehow shutting out complexity. So I think the goal is indeed simplicity, beautiful, simple, parsimonious models, but you can get there in different ways. So, but it's an excellent point because it's very connected to what we're talking about. Hasia, and then Tal.
Hi, so I was just wondering if a configurational theory could be used to refine the so-called beautiful box and arrow theories, because I think in our PhD training, we've been told multiple times that there are so many theories and not enough validation or more nuanced understanding of the theories and their boundary conditions and all the complexity that could be hidden behind the simple box and line graph.
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you, Asia. And I think, yes, in my understanding, that can definitely be done. It can be helpful. And let me just say aloud and clear that I think there's nothing wrong with the boxes and arrows theories. They are, as I mentioned, helpful, and they're being helpful in a number of domains. Question is often, as you pointed out, those theories are often, they have bounded conditions, they have assumptions, and those are somehow also opportunities for future research to take those assumptions or boundary condition and, as people say, endogenize them in the sense of making them instead, rather than assumptions, right, that they become part of the model. So, and you could do that through different heuristics, like questions, what if I remove the assumption of bounded rationality from transaction cost economics, or the assumption of opportunities to the transaction cost economics theory. What would that make? What would that what would happen to the theory? And in doing that, I think the configurational theorizing can be helpful, because essentially is a way of theorizing and thinking that allows you to deal with multiple relationships among multiple explanatory attributes. So you can combine the two if you want, and they could be complementary. Tal, nice to see you.
Hi, Santi. Nice to see you too. And you have a good crowd here too. So I guess my question is pretty straightforward, and that is whether this thinking of yours, whether it has elicited a new definition of a theory, of what a theory is, because, you know, kind of building on what Ravi said before, parsimony and simplicity are kind of really inherent to how we think or define theories, right? A theory is a simplified portrayal of the world. And if you want to have theories resonate with people, then almost by definition, you need to simplify things. You can't portray the world in all of its complexity in such a way, in a model or in a paper even, or sometimes even in a book, to kind of capture the entire complexity. So going back to my initial question, do you have a new definition of what a theory is?
I haven't thought carefully about this, but I think I don't. That would be my preliminary answer. I think, and as we know, there are multiple definitions of theory out there and different traditions, which is actually welcome in our field because it's more playful, and you could, so I welcome that. My own sort of bias is towards an explanatory definition of theory. So I tend to see a theory of a phenomenon as an explanation of that phenomenon, and it's often in our field a verbal statement that explains a phenomenon. Now, that verbal statement is often a relationship, right, between concepts, right? So if you unpack the verbal statement, there are logical connections between concepts that are then verbalized through arguments. So that's how I would define the theory. Now, having said that, I agree that at the end of the day, a theory is a representation of reality and of the phenomenon you're trying to explain in this particular explanatory tradition. And as you just said, Tal, obviously that representation is a simplification. But then the question is how simple and how abstract, right? And have we thrown somehow the baby with the bathwater historically, modeling our field more after the natural sciences and leaving a little bit out the humanities, and if you want, the more anthropological traditions or social psychological. I mean, I'm generalizing here in many ways, but I'm trying just to provoke a little bit of debate. And so you can get to that first. So there are two levels, perhaps. One is that you can nuance that representation in multiple ways. So if I could use this table as an example, and by the way, a table doesn't look necessarily beautiful or non-linear, right? There is linearity definitely in a table, but you have different levels here, right? Essentially what this table tells you is just an example, is that you could have 4 potential explanations to the same phenomenon. You can get to engagement success through 4 different recipes. But what Mike Others and I have been trying to do in this paper, which has been using some of that configuration thinking logic and methods, is essentially linking then those 4 explanations through a common overarching narrative, which is what we call tailored to target. So if we look at those 4 explanations, they all have something in common, which is that the coalitions of investors tailor their levers to the target. Then they can tailor it in different ways, which is why those 4 recipes or explanations emerge. Now, how does it speak to your question? Is that if you think about it, you are here a level of complexity of the theory and a level of simplicity. So you're trying to have a theory that is a bit more nuanced or fine-grained, that are simple representation, but equally tries, and it's a struggle, and I don't think we got it right necessarily, obviously, but tries to embrace simplicity in looking at what's common across those 4 different explanations via unpacking the mechanisms. So the mechanism could drive different explanations, and the mechanism could allow you to perhaps theorize across different explanations. So perhaps it's a complex question, answer to your point, but I hope it kind of gives you a flavor of how we could potentially have more complex representations. They're still parsimonious. So somehow they start from complexity, have a level of simplicity, but not as simple as linear symmetrical relationships.
Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. I just a quick follow-up question, and you don't have to answer it now. Maybe do you think that is also possible in quantitative research?
Yes, I think so. And I think it is increasingly done. I think it's just the way we do research that could change perhaps towards more, mixed methods. But generally, I mean, like you start from quant, but then the best quant papers do that very well. And sometimes you don't need necessarily to mix methods, but you can just argue for the plausibility of the mechanism, bring anecdotal stories, imagine counterfactuals. So that can definitely be done with quantitative methods. I don't think it's necessarily connected with a method or the other one. It's more about the type of theorizing.
Thanks.
Yeah. Ibrat, am I doing all right? Do you want me to entertain other questions, or should I carry on?
If there are any questions, I don't know. I don't see any questions yet, so
Okay.
we can carry on and then we can take more questions.
And maybe we'll revert back to some of the questions in the chat also as we progress, because I've seen that some are there. Thank you all for making this more of an alive conversation. I appreciate that. Just going back to where we were in terms of the conversation, I mentioned before that I also wanted to share what this table looked like initially for us in terms of the co-authors that my co-authors and I, the struggles that I think all of us as just human beings and researchers often face when we try to build a theory with whatever methods. And different methods, to Tal's point, can offer different constraints and opportunities. And so for us was back and forth theorizing in the wild, as I try to label this. This is the one of many versions of the table. The final ones that you saw previously is the one we eventually published. And this one is one of the many versions that we were playing around. And as we often do with co-authors, just send each other different versions, right? And so what's different here? So first of all, if you look at the attributes of the explanatory attributes, we weren't adjectivizing them, and we were organizing them by level of analysis, which we thought was straightforward. So we had in mind a more multi-level theory. We had in mind these different levels of analysis, and we thought that somehow thinking tool of levels of analysis could have helped us theorize better the phenomenon and explain it, but end up a little bit too constraining in our field, in our case, because we didn't have a clear theoretical story behind the relationships. So how different groups of attributes combine and play a different role in an overarching story, in an overarching theory. That level of analysis language didn't help us, because yes, we are the activist investor level, engagement level, firm level, but then how do they connect? And we just, and this could have been also the limits of the way we were thinking, but it didn't sort of help us think. It was heuristically not generative for us. What was more, and also the configurations, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, they were not storified and exemplified with cases. So we did not label them, we did not exemplify them with cases, with vignettes that could somehow, showcase what was going on in each of those recipes with examples. Because if you have to tell those stories and make them resonate, those recipes or those multiple explanations, as I was mentioning, you have to have an example or an illustration for people to connect. And we weren't quite at that stage yet. And finally, in terms of how we labeled and theorize and conceptualize the outcome, we also were calling it activist investors' success or failure. And so the phenomenon was conceptualized as activist investor, that again was based on a pretty high level, superficial, if you want, understanding of the process and a single viewpoint, the viewpoint of the activist. How did we move from that to that theory that I just showed before, which somehow tries to balance complexity and simplicity into a more complex portrait of beautiful theory, if you want? And what we did is that, frankly, we spent countless hours eyeballing through these configurations above, exchanging notes and writing draft stories for each configuration, looking at also what is the overarching theoretical story that is emerging, which was eventually that tailored to target story. And we went back to the cases, did more interviews, and also reconceptualize the attributes and the phenomenon in a way that would allow us to see both the multiplicity, heterogeneity, and complexity, if you want, of the explanation. So 4 explanations that lead to the same outcome that we could label differently, but we could still make sense of those as part of an overarching theory, which is parsimonious in its own right, which is tailored to target. So tailored to target theory is a configuration theory, which is an umbrella, and within that tailored to target, you can have 4 of more potentially different recipes that can lead you to the same outcome. And that was a theory also that allow us to explain the failure of that explanation through different recipes. So I hope this gives you a sense of the back and forth feedback loop, non-linear process of theorizing, which was ugly and messy because there were many different versions of this table. I couldn't put them even on one slide here, where we were drawing visually with arrows, with notes, with different colors. And at some point, it really required somebody for us to interpret what was going on in our own thinking. So this is somehow to just show the behind the scenes of theorizing. If there are no other questions, I'll move to what can we do. And here I have 4 provocations, and they are, if you want, provocations. They are not necessarily fully formed ideas, but they are provocations, and I want to be sort of open here, provocations that have been inspired by my own practice of teaching how to write conceptual papers, teaching how to theorize, teaching how to potentially do theory building. And also they've been inspired by my own practices of theorizing in conceptual papers and empirical papers. The first provocation is make theory more fun, more colorful, and more human. I will say more about what I mean there. The second one is reveal theory's imperfections and incompleteness. And so that equals to me to make theorizing more explicit in our papers, excuse me. So sort of, you know, show the dirty clothes, right, in our papers, make our theorizing more transparent, the way we arrive to certain ideas, the way we connect those ideas into theories. The third one has been said multiple times by multiple people, is practicing multiple styles of theorizing simultaneously on the same phenomenon, what I call theoretical triangulation, and is visualized here by this image of a kaleidoscope as a tool that allows you to see the same image through multiple lenses. And the fourth one is reimagining new canons of beauty for future theorizing. And I will have three ideas there. So I'll start with the first, which is make theory more fun, colorful, and human. And this speaks to an extent to what Peter was suggesting about what's the utility of more beautiful theory. And to an extent, I wonder whether the notion of scholar being a scholar, being an academic, and we know that that notion derives from the medieval times and the monasteries as well, whether that notion somehow is still with us, and we conceive our profession as academics are somehow removed, one step removed from society, one step removed from, you know, how human beings in general think. And so this notion of theory as something that we do as academics, I'm not sure necessarily is necessarily helpful. And in fact, I often in my own practice as either consultant or educator, even in the real world, people say, well, academics theorize, or this is theory, but it's not practical. And I think we could do better if we normalize theorizing just as human everyday activities, and just be more explicit about the fact that we are not the only ones who theorize. People in the real world theorize all the time to make sense of the world. If we move from that perspective, then it could be helpful to analyze theories. They are not necessarily academic theories or scientific theories, but they are theories, folk theories, or conspiracy theories that that people come up with to explain, sometimes in a way that is indeed folkloristic and curious, in real world phenomena. And so I have a picture here of the Capitol Hill attack on January 6th in US, where the crowd was full of colors, but the theories was full of the theories that those people exposed were full of colors too. I'm referring here about the Canons and various conspiracy theories. And you wonder why some of those conspiracy theories are having such resonance. And obviously I don't have hard evidence to bring to the fore, but just a provocation. But there is something about those theories that often speak to people in a way they are empathic with people's feeling, and the aesthetic and the colorfulness of that theory may help them in the reception of those theories. So is there something we can learn there, perhaps by studying those theories, making them the object of our own academic scientific theories, and understand how those explanations come about? What is the theorizing process that happens there? And this also means moving from a notion of theory with a capital T, which is often what my students in the PhDs start with. Oh my God, I need to find a theory. I'll need to review all the literature. And so theory is equated with literature review and with a theory, well, the theory, right, out there, like institutional theory, transaction cost economics, the resource-based view. But those, I would define them as grand theories or meta theories, which is different than come up with your own theory, right? A theory of a specific phenomenon. And again, that humbleness in terms of we are looking for a mini theory, if you want, or a mid-range theory, a theory with a small t of a specific phenomenon, can help us in humanizing and normalizing theorizing just as an everyday activity that everyone around does, not just academics. And that also means making it fun in the sense of really starting from the puzzle, itches, curiosities. And here I have something connected to this, that is what sociologist Diego Gambetta uses, that other sociologists have used, and which I took myself as an inspiration, which is a set of empirical puzzles. So these are facts. So Diego comes up with facts every year that may come from either surveys or reports in whatever countries, Europe, US, Asia. And it just poses these questions that are somehow factual to the students. But the question is then come up with your own explanation. So if you do a theorizing workshop or a theory workshop, you don't start necessarily how to write a conceptual paper and what is a theory in organization management theory. And so all the usual professionalizing talk, if you want, about theoretical contribution and what is a theoretical contribution and gap spotting versus problematizing. All of that is helpful, but perhaps come as a second stage, which is when you know already the craft of theorizing, the pleasure and the fun that comes with theorizing and trying to explain something you don't understand. unless we make it accessible for people, and that speaks also to diversity and inclusion, and make theory a bit more, if you want, inclusive, in the sense of it's not something that only some people can do, but it's something that we all do, frankly, every day. So you start from something that provokes the curiosity. In fact, the questions I start with often on my first day of a theory and theorizing workshop is, you come up with your own puzzle, bring a piece of news, bring something that you couldn't explain, that you have read online on social media, and just let me know what could be a possible hypothesis, if you want, or theory that you can come up with. And that sparks a lot of conversations among students and with me. And it's usually a way of normalizing and making theory more fun. I'll stop here just to pause, make it conversational. Is there anyone who want to ask questions and comments, anything you would like to ask?
Santi, may I?
Yes.
So also on this topic of doctoral training and learning to theorize, what advice do you give in terms of, for those of us who want to nourish this aspect, of learning to do more beautiful theory building or learning to do more beautiful research? How do we nourish that?
I think it's really, it varies from person to person. It's about knowing and getting to know what makes you click, what motivates you, what energizes you, and why. And I think the word theory, theoretical contribution, theorizing could be quite almost threatening and not necessarily accessible. And so almost don't think it as a theory, because if you think, oh, I should come up with a theory, it's already somehow putting a barrier, putting a strain. Think about it as, I just want to come up with ideas, with hypotheses, with guesses, right? Which is what Charles Peirce, right, used to say about abduction. You want to have guesses, right? And you want surprises, right? And you want also to play around with people you like. So I think there's great potential in a PhD cohort in trying to remove any possible competition between classmates around, let's write the paper now. And perhaps this paper needs to be submitted to the AOM or to this other conference by December. I'd rather start from, let's play around some ideas, and everyone can bring in anything that you are curious about. So I will start by embracing what makes you click, what you're curious about, bring and share to a classroom or people, and if not in a classroom, bring and share with people you like and you have fun with, your curiosities and your possible explanation, and find the people you would like to theorize and guess. And I would start from that. And then as you progress, if you want to then write a paper and make it, into a project, then there's plenty of tools. You will have time, but I will iterate on a number of examples, on a number of educated guesses to make it fun, to make it accessible first. That would be my 2 cents.
Thank you, Santi.
I'm happy to share more resources around that, by the way, with whoever is interested, because I'm trying to build a sort of toolkit to teach theorizing and theory a little bit differently. Yeah. Felipe.
Thank you, Santi, for the presentation. It has been super useful, and many of your comments resonate with my own work. I wanted to share just that recently I'm in a current process on an R&R for using novels for theorizing.
Mm-hmm.
And one reviewer says, this is just fun. This is not theory. Exactly the opposite of you are saying. And I think there's a superficiality, if I can say, on what fun is. I think that in management theory, we think that entertaining is not important, or that is far away from the truth. And this, maybe from my own career, I started being just a writer, a storytelling writer. And there I can see that usually management scholars do not know that much about storytelling theory. that is about trying to reach this dramatic moment or tension that is constructed in the way you write and the way you tell the story. And I see this obsession with explaining, that theory is for explaining and not for illustrating. It has made management scholarship much problematic to construct fun theories. And I see that even with the latest, technological advances of ChatGPT and everything, I see that connecting logic with symmetry and beauty in a way is something that technological advances is showing us that logic is not beauty, is what is more replicable, at least by machines. So I think even the fundamentals of what science is and how it's connected to beauty is being much challenged right now. And I think that if we do not go to fun theories and constructing these tensions and learning more about from the humanities, I think I don't see a big future for management scholarship if this continues like this.
Thank you, Felipe. So first of all, good luck with the R&R, and I want to just encourage you. It sounds very interesting in terms of, building theory from novels, and I think there are lots of people that would be interested in hearing what you have to say. And as we know, reviewers are just 2 or 3 people, so whatever they say, just don't take them personally, if I may. I actually agree with you, everything you said. I would just maybe a note of caution. I think for me, the challenge again is not to throw the baby with the bathwater on the other way around. I think science, parsimony, logic, reason, obviously is very important and is what has made a progress on many dimensions. But I would agree with you that humanities, you mentioned novels, but many other fun, those should be more part of what we do. The challenge is how to connect these 2 domains in a way that could speak to each other. And obviously I have no solution. There are people who are trying to do in a number of fields, and so we can get inspired and perhaps build a collection of resources of people that have done that. One name that obviously comes to mind is Jim March. Jim March is obviously was unfortunately, as you all know, passed away, a poet himself. He built a series of also movies around leadership that were inspired by novels. His big agenda, especially towards the end of his life, was connecting the humanities with the social sciences and with management. So it would be interesting, right, to just bring that forward in new ways. I'm with you also regarding the technology, 100%. I think was Mohammed next, and then Ravi. Mohammed?
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation and for sharing your thoughts. So I had 2 questions. The first one is, I would say, classic questions, which is I would like to hear your thoughts on who is best positioned to write theory paper or conceptual paper. Is it senior scholars, in your opinion, or rather junior ones? Because I hear a lot of debates that PhD candidates are too junior to dare to write theory papers. So I just want to hear your thoughts on this point. And the second question is, when you say that make theory more fun, along those lines, I was wondering, are you vouching for more phenomena-based theorizing, where we observe something puzzling and then we take it from there? Do you think that the best theories are those who are trying and explain puzzling or unexpected kind of observations or results from the field? Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Mohammed. Thank you for your questions. I on the first one, I think it doesn't matter whether junior scholars or senior scholars. It doesn't matter really. I would also say that the distinction between theoretical and empirical is a bit of a fictional distinction, because empirical papers have theory too, right? Especially in our field. And also you cannot observe data in a vacuum, right? Data, once you call something data, often you have a theory about the phenomenon to start with. So, but let's not get into these sort of complex issues. The short answer, if you want to hear my own take on this, is I think junior scholars or senior scholars can both theorize. It rather depends on, first of all, what it is that you like, what you feel inclined towards doing. And obviously there is a component of obviously careers. So don't disregard that. Obviously there could be risks involved. It may be a learning process as anything else in life. So some junior scholars have seen are more inclined towards theorizing. They kind of like this craft. Others feel more inclined towards empirics, but then they anyway get to theory and theorizing via the empirics. So I think there is no way out. Theory and theorizing, those are integral activities of our field. So it's more to find your way of approaching those, and your way is what matters the most. So whoever tells you this is the way it should be, maybe they're just based on their own experience, which may not be yours, right? So I would go with your way, and obviously observe, listen carefully, and see what others can teach, and etc. Was there a second question I missed?
Yes, the second question was more about the making theory fun and
fun, yes.
About phenomena-based theorizing.
Yeah, I think it's not the only way, but this is certainly what I've been referring. And I think it's easier in my experience. I've been teaching research methods to MSc students. If you start from a phenomenon, an example, an illustration, it's easier, but it's not the only way to make it fun. It could be that you use counterfactual imagination, or to Felipe's point before, you can use novels and try to theorize whether that novel could actually become real from a fantasy. So there could be other ways of making it fun. You know, there are people who haven't analyzed the logical structure of fantasy. So that's another very different reason. But I guess my point there is that it's not. So first of all, the idea is to instill that energy, that emotional pleasure in people when they learn to theorize, so that they can bring that pleasure and that fun element when they actually get serious about their projects. And those projects, you would hope, those are both fun and useful. So it's not just to play around, make it fun, and there's no use. But unless you instill that pleasure, that fun early on, it would then become too professionalized too soon. That's my point. And so the idea is to reconcile the fun and if you want, the professional element. Yeah. Ravi?
Yeah, I just want to have a quick 5-second response to Mohammed's question. As an older man in this audience, I just want to say that the young people are more intellectual, more advanced, more sophisticated in terms of methodologies and so forth. And additionally, the world itself is changing so fast. And the older generation has a lot to learn from the younger generation. So on the intellectual plane, I think you are more than our peers. So please continue to strive towards teaching us, the older generation. So that's the 5-second or 10-second response to him. But I want to come back to Ibrat's point. What does this all mean for guidance for PhD students? I think the first premise should be that research ought to be oriented to new knowledge creation. And even in replications of the old stuff, there is new knowledge, because you're reconfirming or corroborating their continued relevance and not letting these old theories get deleted, because deletion is a very important part in knowledge management. So even in replication studies, there is value in terms of new knowledge creation. But research, I want to split that word into two pieces. Research, that is, you're searching back into what has already been done. As Isaac Newton famously said, I stood on the shoulders of the giants who stood before me so that I can see afar. So it's very, very important to link back whatever you're trying to do in terms of new knowledge creation to what has already been established as empirically done or theoretically done. Whatever the prior knowledge is, you build on it. However, I want people to look at, the PhD students to look at knowledge development, new knowledge creation along a spectrum. At one end, there is high level of prior knowledge present. There's a lot of research done. along the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, it's so novel, so totally new, there's no prior knowledge present. So at the other extreme where there is no prior knowledge present, you have to do grounded research. That is, let the data speak for what the latent relationships are, and then reveal those empirically significant relationships, and then construct a narrative or a theory around that. But at the other extreme, where there's a lot of prior knowledge, then perhaps you have to do a lot of comprehensive literature review, identify gaps, maybe broaden the research models and so forth. So PhD students have to really embrace the idea that their effort, time, and research effort is essentially directed at new knowledge creation, even if it is a replication study. I'll stop at that.
Thank you. Thank you, Ravi. Also in terms of the call to preserve knowledge and don't delete it, it's very important. I'm a bit confused on what I'm sharing. Am I still sharing the presentation, Ibrat? Yeah?
Yes, it still shows make theory more fun, colorful, and human.
Okay, okay, here I am. Yeah, I couldn't see from my side because I wanted to look at everyone's here. Okay, so I'll just carry on a little bit with the other, if you want, provocation, which I have, which going back is reveal theory's imperfection and incompleteness. But let me introduce this, so make theorizing more explicit. What does that mean? And I want to start from these beautiful quotes, which is one of my favorite quotes by William James, and is a bit, as you can tell, aged, because he only talks about men in his, but imagine this is men and women, obviously. But the intellectual life of men and women consists almost wholly in a substitution of a conceptual order for the perceptual order in which their experience originally comes. And Carl Weick is, as always, very provocative in building on William James' older book, 1911, and link it with theorizing. And he has this way of thinking about theorizing as an activity that involves monstrous abridgments between perception and conception. And each of these monstrous abridgment is an equivalent of some partial aspects of the full perceptual reality. What does this mean? And I love these quotes, but I wanted to try to make it even simpler possibly. If you think that that's my way of at least building on this, you could think of all of us are embedded in a perceptual flux in William James terminology. If you think about experience, about what you have done today, right? You wash your teeth, you go out, you dress up, but we are in a flux, right? And part of this flux is routine, part of this, but we are living bodies. And we live forward, right? Our experience is you wake up and you are progressing through time, right? And we often, in terms of experience, if you encounter something, you don't necessarily name that something in a category. Obviously, there are many objects, whatever, a phone, a pen that you can name, but there are other things that just come your way. And you smell, for example, a particular smell, or you feel a particular emotion. That is perception, that is experience. But if you think about conception, and here it comes William James with the idea that what theorizing means, and the intellectual activity that we all do, is somehow substituting, capturing, if you want, part of that perception, just a part, just a partial bit of that perception into concepts, into conception. And as part of concepts and building on concept, theories. So theories are part of the conceptual work we do to capture part of that perception, But there's something deeply, deeply different of conception and from perception. First of all, conception is understood backward. So how do we conceptualize is often by rationalizing in our mind backward towards time. So we think about the smell of that flower this morning, and we have a theory of flowers in gardens in England or whatever. I'm just making this up. But we're thinking backward about experience, about our informant's experience, about our phenomenon experiences, but backward. And we try to name those experiences. We attribute names. And also, we're not in flux anymore, but we're sitting on a chair, we are walking, but we're trying to punctuate that experience into categories. That is conception, and is by definition less than perception. Perception is always more in terms of the complexity, the nuances, the richness, the intangible elements, they are lived, embodied. Now, that is by itself something that should make us all, as theorists, quite humble, because we can only capture less than experience. And that's why I love Carl Weick's way of thinking about monstrous abridgments. Because in that level of, in that adjective's monstrosity, you realize that we're doing, no matter what, violence to perception. But that violence could somehow be more or less transparent, in the sense that we could just acknowledge and be more honest, if possible, about what it is we're capturing and what it is that instead we're leaving out, at least according to our own conception, right? Which obviously has its own bias. And so what my call here is to reveal more theories' monstrosity, theories' imperfections, incompleteness, discuss more explicitly how monstrous, how severe our abridgment of reality, of experience is. And in doing so, include multiple voices and sides, and always acknowledge that a writer or a group of writers will always have a point of view. That point of view is often normative. And so just be explicit about it, right? And that can really help. And that doesn't mean necessarily that we are, we're not theorizing, right? Because there is something about this armchair notion of theorizing as objective, scientific, and explaining cause and patterns that brings us towards the almost hiding away the fact that we have a point of view, we have a point of entry, and we are doing monstrous abridgments to perception. And I think everyone would admit that, right? I was just reading this morning, just to share a little bit of my own perception today, how Nobel Science for Physics in 1964, how he came up with the idea of maser and laser afterwards. And in describing that moment of discovery in that interview, which, by the way, is in the Nobel Prize website, he mentions the flowers and the park where he was when he thought about all the experiments he did. I just thought that was beautiful in terms of thinking about the perceptual surroundings of the moment of discovery. And the interview with this man, many years forward, he still remembers the moment where he actually had that eureka moment. So there's maybe a connection there and an humbleness that comes with that. Just in closing, and I think I will not spend too much time on that in the interest of time, but the third provocation that I was about to share, and then I will open up for more questions, I only have these in another slide, is practicing multiple styles of theorizing simultaneously. That is the kaleidoscopic idea that I had. And the idea here is that you can think, and this is drawn from Cornelissen 17 in AMR, but more generally, there are more pieces in organization theory, the journal, like what good theory is and what theory is and what it could be. It's highly recommended. You can think of a style of theorizing that is more propositional and is more alike to what I called earlier correlational theorizing, where you cast theoretical arguments in the language of theoretical propositions. They are often in the shape and form of cause-effect relations. So the more of this, the more of that, or in general, something causes something else. You could think in terms of process theorizing, where instead the theoretical argument is more in the language of a narrative and process model. So we often talk in verbs, and we often use gerunds, and we often try to capture how complex sequence of events, often interdependent, interlocked, events can lead to an outcome of interest. Or you can use what I call configurational theorizing, which is essentially thinking in terms of combinations of recipes, pathways, of trajectories. So combine chains of factors, of attributes, of events that combine to produce an outcome together, join. These are just 3 styles, as they've been called. There could be many others. My call here is not to use one or the other, but rather to play, to be playful, and perhaps take the same phenomenon and do a little experiment with yourself or with your co-authors and say, how can I explain this phenomenon from a propositional theorizing perspective, from a process theorizing, from a configurational theorizing, and maybe using other styles of theorizing there. And finally, just to close, and perhaps we can entertain a few more questions, I want to close with some pictures, because maybe you were expecting more pictures from this presentation. I hope I didn't disappoint you. But what are possible new canons of beauty that could emerge in the future? And, you know, Peter was mentioning before the complexity, the sheer complexity of some of the challenges they're facing humanity. How can we think about new portraits and new canons of beauty? One is perhaps comes from Jackson Pollock. One of his great innovations in art was not just the way he was painting, but the way that he was filming himself while painting. In fact, some people would argue that the videos today, or the pictures of him painting the pictures, painting the paintings that he realized, are even more important than the paintings themselves. That is, to me, an example of making theorizing more explicit. Can we think of ways in which we can perform our theories? Perhaps through bodily movement, perhaps through other forms of representation, could be visual, multimedia, perhaps it could be by videoing ourselves, perhaps it could be, you know, just be more explicit about that sort of process of creation and discovery. The second one is looking at absence in and itself. There is a lot, and this goes back to the distinction that is to an extent artificial between empirical and conceptual papers. We're still quite bounded and focused on what exists. But there is another logic, there is the logic of possibility and plausibility. If you think of natural sciences like physics or astronomy, or in many ways, many other natural sciences, physics has been studied things that they don't see for ages, right? On the principle that they are possible or plausible. So why don't we do that? Because that could be helpful in terms of looking at what's absent for our current capitalistic society, that essentially puts some emphasis on existing organizational forms that we know, but perhaps there could be other organizational forms, other ways of organizing production, consumption, and social relationships that we haven't observed. And so absence could be in itself interesting. And the painting here is one of my favorite sculpture. It's actually a sculpture, not a painting, is Anish Kapoor. And third, the Gioconda, obviously I should close with an Italian reference here, Leonardo da Vinci. And one of the things that often is has been said and actually theorized, and natural scientists have done too, what made the Gioconda, the Mona Lisa, so famous is not just the beauty of the painting, but is the deceitful nature of beauty, because there have been studies about the asymmetrical nature of the painting, of the smile, and how that somehow allows the painting itself to be seen in different ways, depending on where you see in the room, in the Louvre Museum. So is there a way for us to combine symmetry and asymmetry? Because that painting combines the two in ways that are not obvious. And we can get inspiration there on how we can combine the symmetry of a more scientific, if you want, propositional, logical kind of reasoning. I would say correlational rather than logical, because logical could be asymmetrical as well, but scientific correlational kind of reasoning, the symmetrical, with a more asymmetrical kind of reasoning. It is common more in narrative. So I just wanted to close with these provocations. I know we are at time and many of you will may have to leave. I could stay for a little longer if you want me to, if you have any concluding questions or comments. So if you have any, please feel free to either unmute yourself or just drop your question in the chat.
Thank you, Santi. Very stimulating talk. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks, Ravi. Appreciate it.
Santi, would you distinguish between elegance and beauty when it comes to in the way we theorize, the way we present our boxes and arrows? Because on one hand, they could be elegantly presented, but is there beauty in them?
It's a great question. So usually the words are used as almost quasi-synonymous. Something elegant can be understood as something beautiful. I think I would say that elegance is not a necessary condition for beauty, and you can find different canons of beauty where elegance could be more or less present. So the question is, what canons of beauty can we think of, right? And art obviously is a great field where the canons of beauty have evolved in such a way that wasn't necessarily easy to predict. We are going a bit slower as a field. We still have a very consistent canon, which has been modeled on the natural sciences. That's my take, but again, I'm over stereotyping for sure, because there are already multiple canons that we can leverage. There's still one perhaps dominant. That's the only thing. So to your point, Ibrat, I think elegance could be a part to a different degree in different ways and shapes and forms of a canon of beauty. That's the way I see it, but it's a great question.
Thank you, Santi. Just waiting to see if there are any more questions in the room. Okay, well, Nilufar.
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed the way that you explain about theorizing. It is like very complex and messy. And I really appreciate all your inputs. One question that I have is just, do our journals are ready for such kind of complex, asymmetric, let's say, theory to just like, sorry, I missed the first part of your session. Maybe you already said it, but do our all journals are actually ready for such kind of theories?
So I think, there is a broader variety of journals, and it's about look at what gets published, but not being limited by what is published. Talk with editors, talk with people who are published there, talk definitely with editors. I'll give you an example just because it's the one I know most. I'm senior editor at Organization Studies. If you read Organization Studies, there is a broad variety and plurality of theorizing. There is a media review where they review movies. There are often lots of pictures, lots of videos. There are supplemental materials. So Organization Studies, just as an example, it is very open. Now, I guess it's also about understanding what's possible, not just what has been done. And so my suggestion, Nilufar, is to really have a conversation with, there are people behind journals, and so have a conversation with the editor. And if you have an idea that is still half there, right, maybe an extended abstract or just a paragraph, just drop them a line and say, hey, do you think this has potential, and can we have a chat? And there's nothing wrong with that, frankly. And so it's about, that's how innovation comes about. And another field that could be very interesting to look at is social studies of technologies. Back then, Latour, Woolgar, and company, they did many art exhibitions that were mixing and matching very different tools and multimedia. So there are inspirations that we can build on there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Valentina?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for the session today. My question is about understanding how to find the right theory for the phenomenon you're studying. So I've been looking at artificial intelligence at work, specifically in the creative space and the human-machine relationship. And so in the beginning, when I first started, I was very quant and like looking at it with a quant lens, and it was so hard to match a perfect theory. And so I switched to qual to have more of a narrative and have the data speak. But even then, like, what advice would you give to studying something that is very phenomenon driven, and then having, because it's new, there, like, you kind of have all these theories available to you. You can draw from so many. And so trying to find this nice marriage between, you know, what you're seeing in the data and also this wide range of theories that you can choose from.
So it is a great question, and one that would deserve perhaps a seminar in its own right. I think, first of all, you are in good company. It means you're doing good things, meaning you're proceeding well. It is normal to be confused. What I do is I tend to find helpful to use so first of all, let me just say, it is very difficult not to use any theory, because data by themselves, you need to put names of what you observe, and putting names and labels, you are already somehow at some level conceptualizing. So data are always conceptualized, but we have a choice though, in terms of what kind of concepts, and some concepts are more theory heavy than others. I'll give you an example, with all due respect for my colleagues who have used, and I've used myself, institutional theory on several occasions. I've used institutional logics, organizational field. Those concepts are long, complex definitions, they're meta concepts, so they could be a little bit too heavy at the beginning of a research, right? So you may want to let the phenomenon speak as much as possible, which means use concepts that are a bit less theory heavy to start with. And as you use those concepts to describe the phenomenon, then what I try to do is what it is that they cannot explain in the empirical story. What are the surprising findings? What your informants lead you towards, and what you yourself as someone who is observing and triangulating, it just doesn't fit. It's the misfits, it's the contradictions, it's the surprises and the puzzles, something that doesn't add up. That's where usually my hunch is. That's where I will start work, and you'll need to find a name for that surprise, for that contradiction, and that's usually how I restart the process. But it's a process, takes time, and so just cut yourself some slack, and it is normal to just be confused on multiple theories at the beginning. It will require some time.
Okay, thank you.